Runaway heiress finds love with mysterious billionaire. The champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers, crystals shattering like her carefully constructed dreams across the marble floor of the Davis estate's grand ballroom. Jada Davis stood frozen in the doorway of what should have been her sanctuary, her father's private study, watching her fiancé Blake Whitmore locked in a passionate embrace with her own cousin Victoria. Their bodies pressed against the mahogany desk where she'd signed countless business documents, where she'd learned the weight of carrying the Davis name, where she just moments ago retreated to calm her pre-engagement party nerves. "God, Victoria, you taste even better than I remembered." Blake's voice was thick with desire as his hands tangled in her cousin's perfectly styled hair. "After tonight's announcement, we'll have to be more careful. But once I'm married to that naive little heiress, we'll have everything we wanted." Victoria's laugh was cruel, sharp as broken glass. "Poor Jada. She actually believes you love her. If she only knew this whole engagement was Harrison's idea, keep the money in the family, keep her under control." Her manicured nails raked down Blake's chest. "She's always been so desperate to please Daddy, to prove she deserves her inheritance despite being his biggest disappointment." The words hit Jada like physical blows. 3 years. 3 years of believing Blake saw something special in her, something beyond the Davis fortune. 3 years of convincing herself that the pressure from her father to marry appropriately had simply aligned with her heart's desires. 3 years of molding herself into the perfect political wife, the perfect heiress, the perfect daughter. Thunder crashed outside the mansion's towering windows, and lightning illuminated the rain beginning to streak down the glass. The storm that had been brewing all evening was finally unleashing its fury, matching the tempest now raging in Jada's chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away from the doorway, her designer heels silent on the thick Persian rug. In that moment, watching the man she'd planned to marry tomorrow morning worship her cousin's body with his hands and mouth, Jada felt something crack open inside her chest. Not just her heart, though that was certainly shattering, but something deeper. The cage she'd been living in, built from expectations and obligations and the desperate need to prove herself worthy of love, began to splinter. Have you ever had a moment that shattered everything you thought you knew about love? A moment when the careful life you'd constructed revealed itself to be nothing more than an elaborate prison? Tonight, Jada Davis was about to discover that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the courage to run away from what's wrong and race toward the unknown. The engagement party continued in the ballroom below, 200 of New York's elite celebrating a union that was nothing more than a business transaction. Jada could hear the string quartet playing, could hear her father Harrison's booming laugh as he worked the room, cementing political alliances and business deals. In a few hours, she was supposed to walk down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral, wearing her grandmother's pearls and her mother's wedding dress, promising to love and honor a man who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone to power. But as thunder shook the mansion's foundations and rain began to pummel the windows with increasing intensity, Jada made a decision that would change everything. She turned away from the study, away from the lie her life had become, and walked swiftly toward the servants' staircase that led to the mansion's rear entrance. Her hands shook as she grabbed her purse from the foyer table, her mind reeling with fragments of overheard conversations, moments that now made terrible sense. Blake's distraction during their intimate moments, always seeming to be performing rather than present. Victoria's subtle undermining disguised as concern, always whispering doubts about Jada's worthiness, her intelligence, her desirability. Her father's increasing control over every aspect of her life, his insistence that she abandon her environmental science degree to focus on more appropriate pursuits for a future senator's wife. The rain hit her like a physical force the moment she stepped outside, immediately soaking through her silk evening gown. The storm had transformed the familiar grounds of her childhood home into something wild and unrecognizable. Lightning illuminated the winding driveway, and without conscious thought, Jada began to run. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement for only a few steps before she kicked them off, leaving them abandoned on the circular drive like discarded shackles. The rain plastered her hair to her skull, washed away her carefully applied makeup, and turned her designer gown into a clinging second skin. But for the first time in years, she felt alive. Terrifyingly, devastatingly alive. She had no plan, no destination. She only knew she couldn't go back to that house, couldn't face the morning, couldn't marry a man who saw her as a business acquisition. The storm seemed to be guiding her, pushing her away from everything she'd known towards something uncertain but real. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Hello once again, my beautiful Love Diaries family. Come, settle in close as we gather around our virtual fireplace tonight. Can you feel it? That warm, golden glow that surrounds us whenever we come together to share these stories that heal our hearts and remind us what true love really looks like. This space we've created together isn't just a channel, it's a sanctuary. A place where souls connect across continents, where your stories inspire others to believe in love again, where every comment and heart you leave becomes part of a tapestry of hope that reaches around the world. I want you to know that your presence here, your beautiful hearts that beat with the same longing for authentic connection, give me the strength to keep sharing these passionate journeys with you. Every time you tell me how a story touched your soul, every time you share your own experiences of heartbreak and healing, you remind me why we do this together. I'm curious, where in this beautiful world are you watching from today? Whether you're in a bustling city feeling lost in the crowd, or tucked away in a quiet countryside village where the stars shine bright, drop your location in the comments below. I love imagining all of you, scattered across this vast world, united by our shared belief that love, real, transformative, soul-deep love is still possible. This story is going to take us on a journey that will test everything we believe about choosing safety over authenticity, about the courage it takes to walk away from a lie and step into truth. We're going to witness a love so powerful it transforms not just two people, but everyone around them. We'll experience passionate highs that will leave you breathless and heart-wrenching lows that will bring tears to your eyes. This isn't just a story about romance, my beautiful family. This is a story about the courage to be vulnerable, about choosing love over fear, about discovering that sometimes the person who can heal our deepest wounds is the one we least expect to find. It's about learning that authentic love doesn't ask us to be perfect, it asks us to be real. So take a deep breath, let yourself sink into this moment with me, and prepare your heart for a story about a woman who thought she knew what love looked like, and a man who had given up on love entirely, until one stormy night changed everything they believed about themselves and each other. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and Jada Davis was completely, utterly lost. Chapter 2. She'd been driving her father's backup car, an older BMW he kept for staff use, for what felt like hours through the storm, following winding roads that led away from the Davis estate and deeper into the countryside. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential rain, and more than once she'd nearly missed the sharp curves that snaked through the wooded hills of upstate New York. Jada had no idea where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stop, couldn't turn around, couldn't face the inevitable questions and consequences waiting for her back home. By now, the engagement party guests would have noticed her absence. Blake would be searching for her, probably more concerned about his political future than her well-being. Her father would be calculating damage control, spinning stories to protect the family reputation. But she was done being someone else's calculation. The thought gave her a fierce sort of strength, even as exhaustion began to creep into her bones. She'd spent 28 years being the perfect daughter, the perfect heiress, the perfect fiancée. She'd buried her own dreams so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Her passion for marine conservation, her research on ocean restoration, all dismissed as hobbies by her father, who insisted she focus on more practical pursuits for a senator's wife. As lightning illuminated the road ahead, Jada caught sight of towering iron gates flanked by stone pillars. In her exhausted, emotionally raw state, the entrance looked like salvation. Without thinking, she turned into what she assumed was a hotel driveway, desperate for shelter from the storm raging both outside and within her chest. The driveway stretched on much longer than expected, winding through mature trees whose branches created a tunnel of green even in the darkness. When she finally reached the end, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a hotel, it was a mansion. But not the ostentatious display of wealth she was accustomed to. This was something different. Something that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, all natural stone and soaring glass windows that reflected the storm like captured lightning. She sat in the car for a long moment, engine running, windshield wipers still fighting the rain. What was she doing? She couldn't just show up at a stranger's home in the middle of the night, soaking wet and emotionally destroyed. But as another crack of thunder shook the ground beneath her, she realized she didn't have much choice. The man who answered the door was nothing like what she'd expected. Gabriel Phoenix stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and lean with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it. He wore simple jeans and a paint-splattered button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms marked with what looked like old scars. But it was his eyes that stopped her, cold, deep green, intelligent, and guarded in a way that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Jada became acutely aware of how she must look, designer gown clinging to her curves, mascara probably streaked down her cheeks, hair a wild mass of natural curls freed from their evening's careful styling by the rain. She was used to being seen as polished, controlled, perfect. Now she was raw, vulnerable, real. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice hoarse from the cold and her earlier tears. "I think I made a mistake. I was looking for a hotel, but I got lost in the storm, and I saw your gates." She trailed off, suddenly feeling foolish. Gabriel's expression softened as he took in her bedraggled state. Something in her voice, some note of genuine distress, seemed to reach past his initial wariness. "There's no hotel for miles," he said, his voice low and warm despite the guardedness in his eyes. "Come inside before you catch pneumonia." He stepped aside, and Jada found herself hesitating on the threshold. Everything about this felt dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. There was something about this man, something in the way he looked at her like he was seeing her rather than the Davis heiress, that made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and anticipation. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. "Gabriel," he replied, extending his hand. "Gabriel Phoenix." When their fingers touched, Jada felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. His hand was warm, strong, marked with calluses that spoke of work beyond whatever had built his obvious wealth. The contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough to send awareness ricocheting through her entire body. "Jada," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jada Davis." If he recognized the name, and given the Davis media empire's prominence, he should have, he gave no sign. Instead, he was already moving, disappearing into what looked like a mudroom and returning with a thick, soft towel and an oversized sweater. "You're shivering," he observed, wrapping the towel around her shoulders with gentle efficiency. "Let me get you something warm to drink while you get out of that wet dress." The casual intimacy of the moment, this stranger caring for her comfort without question or expectation, nearly undid her completely. When was the last time someone had tended to her needs without calculating what they might gain in return? Have you ever felt that instant connection with someone that both thrills and terrifies you? That moment when a stranger's kindness touches something deep inside your soul that you thought was unreachable? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear about the unexpected moments that changed your heart. As Gabriel led her deeper into his home, Jada found herself studying him from beneath lowered lashes. He moved with quiet confidence through spaces that were both luxurious and comfortable, filled with artwork that looked original and furniture that invited you to stay a while. This wasn't the cold showplace she'd grown up in, where every surface was for display rather than living. "The guest bathroom is through there," he said, pointing down a hallway lined with what looked like original paintings. "Take your time. I'll be in the kitchen." Alone in the beautifully appointed bathroom, Jada caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her carefully crafted exterior had been completely stripped away by the storm, leaving behind someone she hadn't seen in years, someone real. Her natural hair formed a crown of soft curls around her face, and without the makeup that usually defined her features, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but somehow more herself than she had in ages. She slipped out of the ruined gown and into Gabriel's sweater, which fell to mid-thigh and smelled faintly of paint and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. The soft fabric felt like a caress against her skin, and she found herself wondering about the man who'd worn it, what he did with his hands to earn those calluses, why paint stains marked his clothes. When she emerged, she found Gabriel in a kitchen that managed to be both elegant and welcoming. He stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, and the domestic intimacy of the scene made her chest tighten. How long had it been since she'd felt this kind of simple comfort? "Better?" he asked, turning to look at her, and she watched his eyes darken as they took in her appearance in his sweater. "Much," she said, though the word came out breathier than intended. There was something about the way he looked at her, not assessing her value or calculating her usefulness, but simply seeing her, that made heat pool low in her belly. He poured steaming liquid into 2 mugs and handed her one. "Hot chocolate," he explained. "With a little something extra to take the chill off." The drink was perfect, rich and warm with just a hint of something that burned pleasantly on the way down. But it was the way their fingers brushed when he handed her the mug that nearly made her drop it. The same electric awareness that had sparked when they first touched was still there, humming between them like a live wire. "So," Gabriel said, settling against the kitchen counter with his own mug, maintaining just enough distance to be proper while still close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "What brings Jada Davis out on a night like this, running from something that left her looking like her world just ended?" The gentle question, asked without judgment but with genuine concern, cracked something open inside her chest. Before she could stop herself, the whole story came tumbling out: Blake's betrayal, her father's manipulation, the engagement that had been nothing more than a business arrangement, her desperate flight into the storm. Gabriel listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face, and Jada found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. How she'd always felt like she was performing in her own life, how she'd buried her dreams to meet everyone else's expectations, how she'd convinced herself that settling for a loveless marriage was the responsible choice. "I feel like such a fool," she finished, staring down into her mug. 28 years old, and I don't even know who I really am." "You're not a fool," Gabriel said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. "You're brave. It takes courage to walk away from a lie, even when the truth is terrifying." The way he said it, with such quiet conviction, made her wonder what truths he'd had to face in his own life. There was something in his eyes, some shadow of old pain, that called to the wounded part of her heart. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What's Gabriel Phoenix's story?" For a moment, she thought he might deflect, might maintain the polite distance of host and unexpected guest. But then something shifted in his expression, some decision made, and he began to speak. He told her about growing up in foster care, about aging out of the system at 18 with nothing but determination and a scholarship to study computer science. He spoke of building his tech empire from a dorm room, of the mentor who'd betrayed him when success came, of learning that wealth could buy comfort but not trust, not connection, not love. "I've spent the last 10 years building walls," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "Telling myself that being alone was better than being used." The parallel between their stories wasn't lost on either of them. Both raised in wealth but starved for authentic connection, both learning to protect themselves by becoming what others expected rather than revealing who they truly were. As the storm continued to rage outside, something electric began to build between them in the warm circle of kitchen light. It was more than attraction, though Jada was acutely aware of every detail about Gabriel, the way his shirt stretched across his broad chest, the grace in his hands as he gestured while speaking, the intensity in his eyes when he looked at her. It was recognition. Soul-deep, terrifying, beautiful recognition. When thunder crashed particularly close, making her jump, Gabriel was there instantly, his hand settling warm and steady on her shoulder. The contact sent heat racing through her veins, and when she looked up into his eyes, she saw her own awareness reflected back at her. "You're safe here," he said quietly, but his voice was rougher than before, and his hand lingered on her shoulder longer than strictly necessary. "Am I?" she whispered, because safety felt like the last thing she was in this beautiful stranger's presence. Her heart was racing, her skin was on fire where he touched her, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that Gabriel Phoenix was the most dangerous man she'd ever met, not because he might hurt her, but because he might heal her. And healing, she was beginning to realize, required a kind of vulnerability she'd never allowed herself before. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and as Gabriel's thumb traced a small circle on her shoulder through the soft wool of his sweater, Jada found herself hoping it never would. Chapter 3. Gabriel's hand dropped from her shoulder, but the warmth lingered like a brand against her skin. He stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair, and Jada could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the pull toward her warring with whatever walls he'd built to protect himself. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The guest room is upstairs, second door on the right. We can figure out getting you back to civilization in the morning." Civilization. The word felt foreign now, after hours in this warm bubble of honesty and connection. The thought of returning to her father's mansion, to the wreckage of her engagement, to the carefully controlled world where every emotion had to be managed and every desire suppressed, made her chest tighten with something close to panic. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly, the admission surprising them both. Gabriel's eyes searched her face, looking for something, certainty, perhaps, or understanding of what she was really saying. "Jada. I know how this looks," she said quickly, heat rising in her cheeks. "A runaway bride showing up at a stranger's door, saying she doesn't want to go home. I know it sounds crazy, but for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I can breathe." The raw honesty in her voice seemed to affect him deeply. His carefully maintained distance cracked, and for a moment she saw past his walls to the man beneath, lonely, guarded, but hungry for the same authentic connection she'd been craving. "It doesn't sound crazy," he said softly. "It sounds like someone who's finally ready to stop living everyone else's life." The understanding in his voice, the complete lack of judgment, nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had truly listened to her, had seen past the Davis heiress to the woman beneath? "I should let you sleep," Gabriel said, but he made no move to leave the kitchen. Instead, he leaned against the counter, studying her with those perceptive green eyes. "Unless, are you one of those people who reads when they can't sleep?" The question was casual, but there was something underneath it, an invitation, perhaps, or a test. "I used to be," Jada admitted. "Before my life became so scheduled that reading for pleasure felt like a luxury I couldn't afford." Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a kind of recognition that made her pulse quicken. "Come with me," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it less request than gentle command. He led her through the house, past artwork that spoke of sophisticated taste and rooms that managed to be both elegant and lived in. But it was when he opened the doors to his library that Jada's breath caught in her throat. The room was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with books, comfortable leather chairs positioned near a massive stone fireplace, and tall windows that during the day would flood the space with natural light. But tonight, with the storm raging outside and flames dancing in the fireplace, it felt like a sanctuary. "This is incredible," she breathed, running her fingers along the spine of a well-worn copy of Dante's Inferno. "You know Dante?" Gabriel asked, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost," she quoted softly. "It feels appropriate tonight." Gabriel's eyes darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. Most people don't know Dante beyond the popular quotes. Most people don't grow up with a classics tutor who believed a proper education required understanding both beauty and suffering, Jada replied, then immediately felt heat rise in her cheeks. How pretentious she must sound, this spoiled heiress with her elite education. But Gabriel didn't look put off by her privilege. Instead, he was studying her with new interest, as if she'd revealed another layer he wanted to explore. "What else did your tutor teach you?" he asked, settling into one of the leather chairs and gesturing for her to take the one opposite. What followed was unlike any conversation Jada had ever experienced. They talked about literature and philosophy, about the books that had shaped them and the ideas that kept them awake at night. Gabriel was brilliant, not just intelligent, but thoughtful in a way that made every exchange feel like a discovery. She learned that he'd taught himself Italian to read Dante in the original, that he'd built his first computer from scraps found in dumpsters, that despite his wealth he still lived simply because luxury felt empty without someone to share it with. He learned that she'd secretly minored in environmental science, that she'd published research on ocean acidification under a pseudonym, that her real passion lay in marine conservation, work her father had dismissed as unmarketable for a senator's wife. "You published research?" Gabriel asked, leaning forward in his chair. "What was your focus?" For the first time in years, Jada found herself talking about her real work, her real passion. She spoke about coral reef restoration, about the delicate balance of marine ecosystems, about the innovative approaches she developed for ocean cleanup that could be implemented on a massive scale. Gabriel listened with an intensity that made her skin warm, asking questions that proved he wasn't just being polite but genuinely engaged with her ideas. When she mentioned a particular challenge she'd been working on, finding sustainable funding for large-scale marine restoration, his eyes lit up with interest. "I've been looking for meaningful applications for some of my tech patents," he said thoughtfully. "Environmental applications, specifically. What you're describing could revolutionize ocean conservation." The possibility of combining their expertise, of working together on something that mattered, sent excitement racing through her veins. But it was more than professional interest, it was the thrill of being seen, really seen, for her mind and her passions rather than her inheritance. As the night wore on and the fire burned lower, their conversation grew more intimate. Not physically, they maintained careful distance in their respective chairs, but emotionally. Gabriel spoke of the loneliness that came with success achieved in isolation, of wondering if he'd ever find someone who wanted him rather than his wealth. Jada shared her fear that she'd spent so long being what others expected that she'd lost track of who she really was, her worry that she was too damaged by years of emotional manipulation to ever trust her own feelings about love. "You're not damaged," Gabriel said quietly, and there was such conviction in his voice that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "You're awakening." The word hung between them, charged with meaning that went far beyond the literal. Awakening to her own desires, her own worth, her own capacity for authentic connection. Awakening to the woman she'd always been beneath the carefully constructed facade. It was past 2 in the morning when thunder crashed so close to the house that the windows rattled in their frames. The sudden sound made Jada jump, her heart racing from more than just surprise. Without thinking, she reached out, and Gabriel was there, moving from his chair to kneel beside hers, his hands covering hers where they gripped the leather armrests. "It's just thunder," he said softly, but his voice was rough with something that had nothing to do with reassurance. "I know," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. The warmth of his hands on hers, the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and rare, the scent of him, paint and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse race, was overwhelming her senses. "Jada," he said, her name a prayer on his lips, and she could see the war being fought in his green eyes. Want battling with restraint, desire fighting with the knowledge that she was vulnerable, that she'd fled to him in crisis and he had a responsibility not to take advantage. But she wasn't thinking about responsibility or appropriateness or the fact that she'd only met this man hours ago. She was thinking about the way he'd listened to her dreams without dismissing them, the way he'd seen her intelligence and passion as assets rather than inconveniences, the way he looked at her like she was a woman worth knowing rather than a prize worth winning. "I've never..." she began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate what she was feeling. "Never what?" he asked gently, his thumb stroking soft circles over her knuckles. "I've never felt like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I might spontaneously combust from wanting someone." Gabriel's breath caught, and she watched his control slip another notch. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" She turned her hands in his, palm to palm, and felt the calluses she'd noticed earlier. "You have paint under your fingernails." The observation seemed to surprise him. "I was working when you arrived." "I paint when I can't sleep." "What do you paint?" she asked, genuinely curious but also desperate to keep him close, to maintain this intimate bubble they'd created. "Lately?" His eyes searched her face, and she saw the moment he decided to be honest. "Dreams. Memories. Things I want but tell myself I can't have." The admission hung between them, raw and vulnerable, and Jada felt something shift in the space separating them. The air grew thick with possibility, with the weight of attraction that had been building since the moment she'd appeared on his doorstep. "Show me," she said quietly. Gabriel's eyes darkened to forest green. "Jada, if I show you my studio, if we go there now." He didn't finish the sentence, but she could hear what he wasn't saying. If they went to his private space, to the place where he created his most intimate work, the careful control they'd both been maintaining would shatter completely. "I know," she said, and meant it. She was done being careful, done being appropriate, done living by other people's rules. For the first time in her adult life, she wanted to follow her own desires, and right now she desired Gabriel Phoenix with an intensity that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Lightning illuminated the library in stark relief, and in that moment of brilliant clarity, Jada saw her future stretching before her in two distinct paths. She could be sensible, could ask him to show her to the guest room, could maintain proper boundaries and deal with her problems in the morning like a responsible adult. Or she could follow her heart into uncharted territory with this beautiful, wounded, brilliant man who saw her soul and made her feel alive for the first time in years. Gabriel must have seen the decision in her eyes, because he rose slowly, never breaking eye contact, and extended his hand. "Are you sure?" he asked, giving her one last chance to choose safety over the unknown. Jada placed her hand in his, felt that now familiar jolt of electricity, and smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As Gabriel led her from the library, their fingers intertwined, thunder crashed overhead and the storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest of desire building between them. They were walking towards something that would change them both forever, and for the first time in her life, Jada wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was racing toward it. Chapter 4. Gabriel's studio was unlike anything Jada had ever seen. Tucked away in what must have been designed as a conservatory, the space was all soaring glass and natural light that would be breathtaking during the day. But now, illuminated by carefully placed track lighting and the intermittent flash of lightning, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Canvases lined the walls in various stages of completion, and the air was thick with the scent of oils and turpentine and something indefinably creative that made her pulse quicken. This wasn't a hobby space. It was the workspace of a serious artist, someone who poured their soul onto canvas with the same intensity he brought to building his business empire. But it was the painting on the easel that stopped her cold. It was a woman caught in a storm, her dress clinging to her curves as rain plastered her hair to her skull. But it wasn't the technical skill that took Jada's breath away, though Gabriel was clearly talented, it was the emotion captured in every brushstroke. The woman in the painting looked lost but not defeated, vulnerable but not broken. She looked like someone on the verge of transformation. She looked like Jada herself, painted weeks before they'd ever met. "I don't understand," she whispered, moving closer to study the canvas. The resemblance was unmistakable, the curve of her jaw, the shape of her eyes, even the way she held herself when she thought no one was looking. Gabriel stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I've been dreaming about you," he said quietly, his voice rough with vulnerability. 4 months. This woman who was running from something, searching for something. I never thought. He trailed off, shaking his head as if he still couldn't believe she was real. Jada turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Gabriel's eyes searched her face, looking for something she wasn't sure she understood. "You said yourself that you felt like you'd been living someone else's life. What if some part of you was calling out, looking for someone who would see you for who you really are?" The idea should have sounded ridiculous, mystical nonsense that her rational mind would immediately dismiss. But standing in this space where art and reality blurred, looking at a painting that captured not just her physical appearance but something deeper, her essence, her longing, her truth, Jada found herself believing. "Show me more," she said softly. Gabriel hesitated, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. These paintings were clearly deeply personal, windows into his soul that he'd never shared with another person. But after a moment, he began moving through the studio, turning canvases to face her. What she saw took her breath away. There were dozens of them, studies of the same woman in different moments, different moods. The woman reading by firelight, her face serene and thoughtful. The woman walking along a beach at sunset, her silhouette strong and confident. The woman laughing, her head thrown back in pure joy. The woman crying, tears streaming down her face as she stared out at a storm-tossed sea. Every painting captured a different facet of femininity, of strength, of vulnerability. And in every single one, Jada recognized herself, not as she appeared to the world, but as she felt in her most private moments. "How long?" she whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from a particularly intimate portrait of the woman asleep, her face peaceful and unguarded. 2 years, Gabriel admitted. "It started with dreams after my mentor betrayed me, when I was at my lowest point. This woman would appear, and she was everything I thought I'd never find, intelligent, passionate, real. I started painting her to try to understand what my subconscious was telling me." Jada moved from canvas to canvas, seeing her own journey reflected in Gabriel's artistic vision. The progression was clear. The early paintings showed a woman trapped, confined, going through the motions of a life that didn't fit. But as the series continued, she began to see transformation. The woman became bolder, more alive, more authentically herself. "This one," she said, stopping in front of a painting that made her chest tighten with recognition. It showed the woman in what was clearly an engagement dress, but her face was turned away from the viewer, toward a window where storm clouds were gathering. Her posture spoke of resignation mixed with rebellion, of someone on the verge of a decision that would change everything. "I finished that one 3 days ago," Gabriel said quietly. 3 days before her engagement party. 3 days before she discovered Blake's betrayal and fled into the storm. "I don't believe in fate," Jada said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Neither did I," Gabriel replied, moving to stand behind her. "But I'm having a hard time explaining this any other way." She could feel the heat of his body, could smell that intoxicating combination of paint and masculinity that was uniquely his. When she turned to face him, she found herself trapped between his body and the easel, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough to count the paint stains on his shirt. "Gabriel," she began, but whatever she'd intended to say died in her throat when she saw the way he was looking at her. It was the same expression captured in his paintings, wonder mixed with desire, disbelief mixed with hope. As if she were something precious and impossible that he was afraid would disappear if he reached for her. "I've never let anyone see these," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never let anyone see the real me." The admission hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Jada understood what he was really saying, that he was trusting her with more than just his art. He was trusting her with his dreams, his deepest longings, his most guarded heart. "I've never let anyone see the real me either," she confessed, her voice trembling with the weight of honesty. "Until tonight. Until you." Something shifted in the air between them, became charged with possibility and desire and the terrifying beauty of two souls recognizing each other across the vast loneliness of their separate lives. Gabriel lifted his hand, hesitating for just a moment before cupping her cheek with paint-stained fingers. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if he were touching something sacred. "You're even more beautiful than I dreamed," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I was never beautiful," Jada whispered. "I was just, appropriate. Suitable. The right bloodline with the right education and the right connections." "No," Gabriel said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're beautiful because you're real. Because you're brave enough to run into a storm rather than live a lie. Because you light up when you talk about saving the oceans, and because you quote Dante like poetry, and because you looked at my paintings and saw art instead of the obsessive ramblings of a lonely man." Tears pricked at Jada's eyes, because no one had ever seen her this way before. No one had ever made her feel like she was enough exactly as she was, without modification or improvement or careful presentation. "I've been so afraid," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Afraid that if I showed people who I really was, they'd find me lacking. Disappointing." "Impossible," Gabriel said, and there was such conviction in his voice that she almost believed him. "You're extraordinary, Jada Davis. You're everything I didn't dare hope existed." The space between them had narrowed to nothing, and Jada could feel Gabriel's breath warm against her lips. The moment stretched, filled with anticipation and desire and the weight of a decision that would change everything. "If we do this," Gabriel said quietly, "if we cross this line, I need you to know that I'm not Blake. I'm not your father. I don't want to own you or control you or turn you into someone else's vision of who you should be. I want to know you, all of you, exactly as you are." The promise in his words, the respect and desire and genuine caring, shattered the last of Jada's defenses. For the first time in her adult life, she was with someone who wanted her rather than what she represented, someone who saw her dreams as assets rather than inconveniences. "I know," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "I trust you." Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the most unexpected moments. If you're loving this journey, hit that subscribe button and tell me, what's the most unexpected place love has found you? I love hearing about those magical moments when souls recognize each other across the vastness of human experience. When Gabriel's lips finally met hers, it was nothing like the polite, passionless kisses she'd shared with Blake. This was fire and tenderness and desperate need all wrapped into one earth-shattering moment. His mouth moved against hers with a hunger that spoke of months of dreaming, years of loneliness, a lifetime of waiting for someone who understood the language of his heart. Jada had been kissed before, but she'd never been kissed like this, like she was air and water and everything necessary for survival. Gabriel's hands tangled in her hair, and she could taste the wine they'd shared earlier, could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that told her she affected him as powerfully as he affected her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not just tonight. Stay and let me show you what it feels like to be cherished." Jada looked into his eyes and saw her own longing reflected back at her. She saw possibility and hope and the promise of a life lived authentically, passionately, real. "Yes," she whispered, and felt the last of her old life fall away like a discarded shell. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside Gabriel's studio, surrounded by paintings that had somehow called her home, Jada was finally, truly awake. Chapter 5. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Jada woke in Gabriel's guest room. He'd been a perfect gentleman despite the electric tension between them, to sunlight streaming through windows that offered a breathtaking view of rolling hills and distant ocean. For a moment, she lay still, wondering if the previous night had been some vivid dream. But then she caught the scent of coffee and something delicious drifting from downstairs, and she knew with absolute certainty that Gabriel Phoenix and his impossible paintings were very, very real. She found him in the kitchen, standing at the stove with his dark hair mussed and wearing jeans that hugged his lean frame in ways that made her pulse quicken. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, warm and beautiful and full of promise. "Good morning," he said, his voice slightly rough with sleep. "I was beginning to think I'd dreamed you." "I was thinking the same thing," Jada admitted, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and that now familiar jolt of electricity sparked between them. "Any regrets?" Gabriel asked quietly, and she could see the vulnerability in his green eyes, the fear that daylight might have brought second thoughts about the connection they'd forged in storm and firelight. "Only that I waited 28 years to feel this alive," Jada said honestly, and watched relief flood his features. What followed was unlike any morning she'd ever experienced. Gabriel had prepared breakfast, nothing fancy, just eggs and fresh fruit and toast, but they ate slowly, reluctant to let the intimacy of the moment end. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing childhood memories and philosophical musings and dreams for the future. Jada learned that Gabriel donated most of his wealth anonymously, that he'd taught himself to paint by studying masters in museums, that he'd bought this coastal sanctuary because the sound of waves reminded him that some things in the world remained constant and beautiful despite human cruelty. Gabriel learned that Jada spoke 3 languages, that she'd once spent a summer working on a marine research vessel in the Caribbean, that she'd been secretly funding ocean conservation projects for years through a foundation her father knew nothing about. "You have your own foundation?" Gabriel asked, leaning forward with obvious interest. "It's small," Jada said modestly. "Nothing like what could be accomplished with real resources. But I've been trying to do what I can without my father's knowledge." "Show me," Gabriel said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up from her coffee. What he was asking for was trust, the same trust he'd shown her when he'd revealed his paintings. He wanted to see her work, her passion project, the thing that mattered most to her heart. Over the next hour, Jada found herself sharing research and proposals and plans she'd never shown anyone. Gabriel listened with the same intensity he'd brought to their conversation the night before, asking intelligent questions that proved he understood not just the science but the vision behind her work. "This is revolutionary," he said finally, studying her proposal for large-scale coral restoration. "The applications of your technology could transform marine conservation worldwide. If it could be properly funded," Jada said wistfully. "But the kind of money needed for global implementation." "I have that kind of money," Gabriel said quietly. The words hung between them, loaded with implication. Jada stared at him, her heart racing as she processed what he was suggesting. "You can't be serious," she said. "I've been looking for meaningful applications for my wealth for years," Gabriel replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Environmental conservation, specifically. What you've developed here could change the world, Jada. And I want to help you do it." The possibility of combining their resources, their expertise, their dreams, sent excitement racing through her veins. But more than that, it was the validation of being seen, truly seen, for her mind and her passions rather than her social connections. "We could start a foundation," Gabriel continued, his voice growing excited. "Combine your environmental expertise with my technology background and business infrastructure. We could make a real difference." "We?" Jada repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you want," Gabriel said, suddenly uncertain. "I know it's presumptuous, given that we just met, but I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for someone like you. Someone who cares about making the world better rather than just making money from it." The earnestness in his voice, the hope mixed with vulnerability, made Jada's chest tighten with emotion. Here was a man who saw her dreams as worthy of investment, who wanted to build something meaningful together rather than expecting her to abandon her passions for his convenience. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Gabriel's smile was radiant, and when he reached across the table to take her hand, the contact sent warmth racing up her arm. "There's something else I want to show you," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "If you're not too tired of my revelations." "I don't think I could ever tire of learning who you really are," Jada said honestly. Gabriel led her outside, along a path that wound through carefully tended gardens toward the sound of crashing waves. The day was perfect, clear and warm with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of salt and wild roses. But it was when they reached Gabriel's private beach that Jada's breath caught in her throat. The cove was secluded, protected by towering cliffs on either side, with pristine sand that looked like it had never been touched by anyone but Gabriel himself. Waves rolled gently onto shore, and the water was so clear she could see straight to the bottom. "This is incredible," she breathed, kicking off her borrowed sandals to feel the warm sand between her toes. "It's my thinking place," Gabriel said, settling beside her on a piece of driftwood worn smooth by years of tides. "When the business world gets too complicated or the loneliness gets too heavy, I come here to remember what's real." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching waves roll endlessly onto shore. Jada found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, her usual anxiety about schedules and obligations simply evaporating in the peace of Gabriel's sanctuary. "Tell me about your research," Gabriel said eventually. "Not the technical aspects, the why. What made you care so much about the oceans?" Jada was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. No one had ever asked her that question before, not her professors, not her father, certainly not Blake. They'd all been content to know what she studied without caring about the passion that drove her. "When I was 16, she began slowly, just after my mother died, my father sent me to stay with my aunt in the Caribbean. I think he didn't know what to do with a grieving teenager, and honestly, I was angry at the world and everyone in it." Gabriel listened without interruption, his attention focused completely on her words. "But there was this marine biologist working at the resort where we stayed. Dr. Sarah Martinez. She saw this angry, lost kid and instead of trying to fix me or counsel me or any of the things adults usually do, she invited me to help with her research." Jada's voice grew softer as she remembered those transformative weeks. "The first time I went underwater, really underwater with proper equipment, and saw a healthy coral reef, it was like discovering a whole world I never knew existed. All this incredible life and beauty and complexity, this ecosystem that had been thriving for thousands of years." And Dr. Martinez explained how it was all connected, how every piece mattered, how the health of these reefs affected the entire ocean. "It gave you purpose," Gabriel said quietly, understanding flickering in his eyes. "It gave me hope," Jada corrected. "At a time when I felt like everything beautiful in the world was dying or dead, I found this place of incredible life." "And when Dr. Martinez showed me areas where the reefs were dying, where pollution and climate change were destroying these ancient ecosystems, I knew I had to do something." "Your mother would be proud," Gabriel said softly. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, nearly undid her completely. Tears pricked at her eyes as she thought about her mother, about the woman who'd encouraged her curiosity and intelligence before cancer stole her away. "I hope so," Jada whispered. "She always said I had the power to change the world if I was brave enough to try." "She was right," Gabriel said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him. "You are changing the world. Maybe not in the way your father wanted, but in the way that matters." The validation, coming from this man who barely knew her but somehow saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, cracked something open in Jada's chest. She'd spent so many years doubting herself, wondering if her passion was naive or impractical, if she was wasting her privilege on impossible dreams. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For seeing me. For understanding." Gabriel shifted closer on their driftwood seat, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Thank you for trusting me with your dreams. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and Jada could taste salt on the breeze. This beautiful, secluded place felt like a world apart from her complicated life, from the obligations and expectations that had shaped every decision she'd ever made. I've never felt this free, she admitted, leaning into Gabriel's touch. Neither have I, he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I've spent so many years protecting myself, keeping everyone at arm's length. But with you. With me, she prompted when he trailed off. With you, I want to tear down every wall I've ever built, Gabriel said, his voice rough with honesty. I want to show you everything I am and hope it's enough to keep you here. The rawness in his admission, the vulnerability of a man who'd clearly learned not to trust easily, made Jada's heart race. She could see the fear in his eyes, fear that she would leave, that this connection was too good to be real, that he was setting himself up for another betrayal. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly, covering his hand with hers. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be. Gabriel's smile was like sunrise, brilliant and warm and full of promise. When he leaned in to kiss her, it was soft and sweet and tasted like hope. But as the kiss deepened, as his arms came around her and pulled her closer, Jada felt the now familiar fire begin to build between them. Every touch sent electricity racing through her system, every breath filled her lungs with his scent, every heartbeat reminded her that she was alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. We should go back to the house, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Should we? Jada asked, her hands fisted in his shirt, reluctant to let him go. If we stay here much longer, Gabriel said, his voice strained, I'm going to do something that might be considered ungentlemanly on a second date. Who says I want you to be a gentleman? Jada whispered, surprising them both with her boldness. Gabriel's eyes darkened to forest green, and she could see his carefully maintained control beginning to fray. Jada. I'm tired of being appropriate, she said, her voice growing stronger. I'm tired of being careful and proper and suitable. I want to feel everything, Gabriel. I want to feel alive. The want in her voice, the desperate need to break free from a lifetime of restraint, seemed to shatter Gabriel's resolve. His mouth found hers again, more urgent this time, and Jada felt herself melting into him with a passion she'd never known she possessed. The afternoon sun was warm on their skin as they lost themselves in each other, and for the first time in her life, Jada understood what it meant to be truly, completely desired for exactly who she was. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the shore, but in Gabriel's arms, Jada felt like she'd finally found her home. Chapter 6. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jada found herself on Gabriel's moonlit terrace overlooking the ocean. The day had been perfect, filled with deep conversations, shared dreams, and moments of connection that felt both inevitable and miraculous. But as night fell and reality began to creep back in, the weight of her situation settled over her like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Gabriel found her there, wrapped in one of his sweaters and staring out at the darkening sea. He'd changed into fresh clothes after their afternoon on the beach, but his hair was still tousled from her fingers, and the memory of his mouth on hers sent heat racing through her veins. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, settling beside her on the cushioned outdoor sofa. "I was thinking about tomorrow," Jada admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what happens when this perfect bubble we've created has to meet the real world." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, his arm coming around her shoulders to pull her against his side. The gesture was protective and comforting, but she could feel the tension in his body that matched her own. "What do you want to happen?" he asked finally. "I want to stay here forever," Jada said honestly. "I want to wake up every morning knowing I can be myself, knowing someone sees my dreams as valuable rather than inconvenient. I want to work on projects that matter, surrounded by beauty and peace and—" She trailed off, suddenly shy. "And?" Gabriel prompted gently. And you, she whispered. I want you. All of this, with you. Gabriel's arm tightened around her, and when she looked up, she saw her own longing reflected in his eyes. Then stay, he said simply. We'll figure out the rest together. It's not that simple, Jada said, though her heart leaped at the possibility. My father, the company, Blake. I can't just disappear without consequences. Can't you? Gabriel asked, turning to face her fully. You're 28 years old, Jada. You have your own money, your own research, your own foundation. What's really keeping you tied to a life that makes you miserable? The question hung between them, cutting straight to the heart of her fears. Because Gabriel was right, legally, financially, practically, there was nothing stopping her from walking away from Davis Media, from her father's expectations, from the carefully constructed prison of her old life. Nothing except fear. I've never been on my own, she admitted, her voice small. I've always been someone's daughter, someone's fiancée, someone's heir. I don't know if I'm brave enough to just be me. Gabriel's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. You're the bravest person I've ever met, he said fiercely. You ran into a storm rather than live a lie. You trusted a complete stranger with your deepest truths. You're sitting here considering giving up everything familiar to chase a dream of authentic love. If that's not courage, I don't know what is. What if I disappoint you, she whispered. What if the real me, without all the Davis resources and connections, isn't enough? Impossible, Gabriel said, his voice rough with emotion. You could lose every penny, every connection, every advantage you've ever had, and you'd still be the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Your mind, your passion, your heart, that's what I fell for, not your bank account. The conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty, cracked something open in Jada's chest. For so long, she'd believed her worth was tied to external things, her father's approval, her inheritance, her suitability as a political wife. But Gabriel saw something else entirely, something that belonged to her alone. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I, Gabriel said honestly. I'm terrified that I'm going to wake up and discover this has all been another dream. I'm terrified that you'll come to your senses and realize you deserve someone better than a foster kid who paints his loneliness away. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. The honesty in his admission, the vulnerability of a man who'd learned to protect his heart but was choosing to risk it anyway, shattered the last of Jada's defenses. Kiss me, she whispered. Gabriel's mouth found hers with desperate tenderness, and Jada felt herself melting into him with an intensity that took her breath away. This wasn't the careful, passionless kisses she'd shared with Blake, this was fire and need and the desperate hunger of two souls recognizing their perfect match. His hands tangled in her hair, and she could taste the wine they'd shared at dinner, could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that told her she affected him as powerfully as he affected her. When his mouth moved to trail kisses along her throat, she heard herself make a sound she'd never made before, pure, unfiltered desire. Jada, Gabriel breathed against her skin, her name a prayer on his lips. Tell me to stop. But stopping was the last thing she wanted. For the first time in her life, she was with someone who cherished rather than claimed her, someone who saw her desires as precious rather than inconvenient. Don't stop, she whispered, her hands fisting in his shirt. Please don't stop. Gabriel pulled back to look at her, his eyes dark with want but still careful, still giving her space to change her mind. Are you sure? He asked. We don't have to rush anything. I can wait as long as you need. I don't want to wait, Jada said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I've waited my whole life to feel this way. I've waited my whole life to be with someone who sees me, really sees me. Gabriel's smile was tender and fierce all at once. Without breaking eye contact, he stood and extended his hand. Come with me, he said softly. Jada placed her hand in his, felt that now familiar jolt of electricity, and let him lead her inside. The house was quiet around them, lit only by moonlight streaming through tall windows and the occasional flash of lighthouse beam from the distant shore. Gabriel led her to his bedroom, a space that was elegant but comfortable, with windows that opened onto the ocean and art that spoke of sophisticated taste and deep feeling. But it was the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and rare, that made her pulse race. "Last chance to run," he said, his voice rough with desire held carefully in check. "I'm not running anymore," Jada said, stepping closer until her body was pressed against his. "I'm exactly where I want to be." What happened next was unlike anything Jada had ever experienced. Gabriel's touch was reverent, worshipful, as if he were memorizing every inch of her skin. He took his time despite the urgency building between them, his hands and mouth exploring her body with an attention to her pleasure that made her feel cherished in ways she'd never known were possible. When he finally joined with her, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't just physical joining, it was emotional, spiritual, the melding of two souls who'd been searching for each other across the vastness of human loneliness. "I love you," Gabriel whispered against her throat as they moved together in perfect rhythm, and the words felt as natural as breathing. "I love you too," Jada breathed back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Afterward, they lay entwined in Gabriel's bed, her head on his chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The sound of waves against the shore provided a gentle rhythm, and for the first time in years, Jada felt completely at peace. "No regrets?" Gabriel asked softly, his voice uncertain despite the intimacy they'd just shared. "Only that it took me 28 years to find you," Jada said honestly, pressing a kiss to his chest. Gabriel's arms tightened around her, and she could feel him relax into contentment. They talked quietly as the moon traced its path across the sky, sharing dreams and fears and plans for a future that felt suddenly, brilliantly possible. It was nearly dawn when Jada's phone, forgotten in her purse downstairs, began to ring insistently. The sound shattered the peaceful bubble they'd created, and both of them tensed as reality came crashing back. "I should check that," Jada said reluctantly, though every instinct she possessed screamed at her to ignore it. Gabriel nodded, his face already showing signs of the same dread she felt. "I'll come with you." They found her phone lighting up with dozens of missed calls and text messages, all from the same people, her father, Blake, her cousin Victoria. The most recent voicemail was from Harrison Davis himself, and his voice was cold with fury. "Jada, I don't know what game you're playing, but it ends now. Blake is beside himself with worry, and the press is starting to ask questions about your absence from your own engagement party. You will come home immediately, we will manage this scandal, and you will marry Blake as planned. The contracts have been signed, the agreements are in place. Don't throw away everything I've built over some ridiculous tantrum." The message ended with a sharp click, and Jada felt the walls of her old life closing in around her again. Beside her, Gabriel's jaw was tight with anger. "Contracts," he said quietly. "Agreements?" "My father doesn't see marriage as romance," Jada said wearily. "He sees it as a business merger. Blake's family has political connections Dad needs, and Dad has money Blake's family wants. I'm just the commodity that seals the deal." Gabriel's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You're not a commodity. You're a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and the right to choose her own future." "Tell that to my father," Jada said bitterly. Then, seeing the concern in Gabriel's eyes, she softened. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to drag you into my family drama." "Too late for that," Gabriel said, pulling her into his arms. "You're mine now, which means your battles are my battles." The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her, she'd spent too many years being treated like property to accept it from anyone. But from Gabriel, it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like protection, like partnership, like love. Still, the reality of their situation was unavoidable. Her father wouldn't simply let her disappear, and Blake had too much to lose to accept her defection quietly. The scandal would be massive, the Davis heiress abandoning her fiancé at the altar for a man no one had ever heard of. "There's something else," Jada said quietly, dreading what she had to tell him. "Something I should have mentioned before." Gabriel went very still, and she could see him bracing for impact. "My father's company, Davis Media, we've been in acquisition talks with several tech firms, including Phoenix Industries." The color drained from Gabriel's face as the implications hit him. "Your father is trying to buy my company?" "The board approved preliminary negotiations last month," Jada said miserably. "I didn't make the connection until just now. I've been so removed from company operations that I didn't even know the name of the target acquisition." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his brilliant mind clearly working through the ramifications. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Do you think this is why you were sent away from the engagement party? To create a scandal that would give your father leverage in the negotiations?" The suggestion hit Jada like a physical blow. Was it possible? Had her father somehow orchestrated her escape, knowing she would seek shelter and potentially compromise herself? Was Gabriel's sanctuary just another carefully laid trap? "No," she said firmly, though doubt gnawed at her. "No, my father might be manipulative, but he's not omniscient. He couldn't have predicted the storm, couldn't have known I'd end up here." But even as she said it, Jada could see the suspicion growing in Gabriel's eyes. Too many coincidences, too many connections. A business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she'd accidentally stumbled into the arms of the man her father was trying to acquire. "I need some air," Gabriel said quietly, and Jada felt her heart break a little at the careful distance that had crept into his voice. "Gabriel, please," she began, but he was already moving toward the door. "I'm not leaving," he said, pausing at the threshold. "I just need to think." As the door closed behind him, Jada sank onto his couch and buried her face in her hands. Just when she'd found the courage to reach for happiness, the complicated web of her family's machinations threatened to destroy it. Outside, she could hear Gabriel's footsteps on the terrace, pacing back and forth as he processed this new information. And somewhere in New York, she knew her father was probably already planning his next move. The perfect bubble of their newfound love was about to collide with the harsh reality of power, money, and family loyalty. And Jada wasn't sure their connection was strong enough to survive the impact. Her phone buzzed with another text from Blake. "Jada, whatever you're doing, whatever point you're trying to make, it's time to come home. People are starting to talk. We can fix this, but only if you stop being selfish and think about what's best for everyone." The casual dismissal of her feelings, the assumption that her flight was nothing more than a childish tantrum, made anger flare in her chest. But underneath the anger was fear that Gabriel would decide she was too much trouble, too complicated, too damaged by her family's toxic dynamics to be worth fighting for. She found him on the terrace, standing at the railing and staring out at the ocean. The morning sun gilded his profile, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. Even now, even with doubt and suspicion clouding the air between them, he was the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. "Gabriel," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and the carefully neutral expression on his face made her heart clench. This was the face he showed the business world, controlled, guarded, giving nothing away. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice professionally polite in a way that made her want to weep. "About the acquisition, about the timing of your arrival here, about what your father might gain from this situation." "You think I'm lying," Jada said, and it wasn't a question. "I think," Gabriel said carefully, "that I've learned not to believe in coincidences where large sums of money are involved." The words hit her like physical blows. After everything they'd shared, after the intimacy and honesty and desperate connection, he still doubted her motives. He still saw her as potentially just another person trying to use him. "I understand," Jada said quietly, though understanding didn't make it hurt less. "You've been betrayed before. You have every reason to be suspicious." "Do I?" Gabriel asked, and there was something raw in his voice that gave her hope. Because part of me wants to believe that what happened between us was real, that I haven't been played by someone even more skilled than my mentor. It was real, Jada said fiercely, stepping closer despite the warning in his posture. Everything that happened between us, everything I told you, everything I felt, it was all real. Then prove it, Gabriel said, his green eyes boring into hers. Walk away from your father's company. Refuse the acquisition. Show me that what we have is more important than Davis Media's bottom line. The challenge hung between them, loaded with everything they'd built and everything they stood to lose. Jada understood what he was really asking, not just for proof of her feelings, but for proof that she was willing to choose him over the safety and power of her family name. I can't just walk away from the acquisition, Jada said slowly. I don't have that kind of power in the company. Then what power do you have? Gabriel asked, and the question cut straight to the heart of her insecurities. Because the truth was, she'd never tested the boundaries of her influence. She'd always accepted her father's decisions, his authority, his right to control every aspect of her life. She'd never fought back, never demanded a seat at the table, never insisted on being heard. I don't know, she admitted, and the honesty cost her. I've never tried to find out. Gabriel's expression softened slightly, and she saw a flicker of the man who'd held her so tenderly the night before. Then maybe it's time you did, he said quietly. Before Jada could respond, the sound of car engines coming up the drive made them both freeze. Gabriel's property was gated and private, no one should have been able to reach the house without permission. Expecting someone? Jada asked, though she already knew the answer from the grim expression on Gabriel's face. No, he said, moving to get a better view of the approaching vehicles. But I have a feeling you are. 3 black SUVs were making their way up the winding drive, official and ominous. Jada's heart sank as she recognized the lead vehicle, her father's personal car, the one he used for business that required discretion. He found me, she whispered, though she wasn't really surprised. Harrison Davis hadn't built a media empire by accepting defeat easily. How? Gabriel asked, his business instincts taking over. This property is private, unlisted. Even if he traced your phone, he shouldn't have been able to get past the gates. Money opens a lot of doors, Jada said bitterly. And my father has a lot of money. The vehicles pulled up to the house with military precision, and Jada watched her old life spill out onto Gabriel's pristine driveway. Her father emerged from the lead car, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his silver hair perfectly styled and his face set in the expression that had intimidated boardrooms and politicians for decades. Blake climbed out of the second vehicle, looking haggard and furious, his usually perfect appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he'd spent the night searching for her. But it was the third person who made Jada's blood run cold, Victoria, her cousin and Blake's secret lover, stepping out of the car with a satisfied smile that spoke of victory achieved. This is about to get ugly, Jada said quietly. Gabriel moved to stand beside her, and despite the tension between them, his presence was comforting. Are you ready for this? No, Jada said honestly. But I don't have a choice anymore. As her father and his entourage approached the house, Jada realized that the moment of reckoning she'd been avoiding had finally arrived. She would have to choose, the safety of her old life or the uncertain promise of authentic love. The perfect morning that had started with such hope was about to become a battlefield, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive it intact. Chapter 7. The knock on Gabriel's front door came precisely 5 minutes after the cars had parked, enough time for Harrison Davis to survey the property and formulate his strategy, but not enough time for Jada to prepare herself for what was about to happen. Gabriel answered the door with calm professionalism, but Jada could see the tension in every line of his body. Her father stood on the threshold like a general surveying conquered territory, his pale blue eyes taking in Gabriel's appearance with calculating assessment. Mr. Phoenix, I presume, Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. I'm Harrison Davis. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't deal in human property, Mr. Davis, Gabriel replied smoothly, but Jada caught the edge of steel beneath the polite words. Of course not, Harrison said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. May I come in? I think we have several matters to discuss. Gabriel stepped aside, and Jada's old life invaded her sanctuary like a toxic cloud. Her father moved through Gabriel's beautiful home with proprietorial confidence, Blake trailing behind him like an angry shadow, and Victoria bringing up the rear with that same satisfied smile. Jada, Harrison said when he spotted her, his voice carrying disappointed affection that she recognized as performance. Darling, we've been worried sick. When you disappeared from your own engagement party. I didn't disappear, Jada said, finding her voice despite the intimidation tactics. I left. There's a difference. Is there? Harrison's eyebrows rose as if her distinction amused him. Blake has been beside himself with concern for your well-being. Blake stepped forward, his face a picture of wounded devotion that would have been convincing if Jada hadn't seen him with Victoria just days before. Baby, whatever's wrong, whatever I did to upset you, we can fix it. Just come home with me. The endearment, used so casually in front of Gabriel, made Jada's skin crawl. She saw Gabriel's jaw tighten, saw the flash of something dangerous in his green eyes. There's nothing to fix, Blake, Jada said steadily. Our engagement is over. Don't be ridiculous, Victoria interjected, speaking for the first time. You're obviously upset about something, but running away like a child isn't going to solve anything. The casual dismissal, coming from the woman who'd been intimate with Jada's fiancé, was breathtaking in its audacity. Jada felt anger rise in her chest, clean and strengthening. You're right, Victoria, she said calmly. Running away doesn't solve anything. That's why I'm not running anymore. Harrison's eyes sharpened at the shift in his daughter's tone. This wasn't the compliant, people-pleasing woman he'd raised. This was someone new, someone stronger. Jada, he said, his voice taking on warning undertones, you're clearly overwrought. Mr. Phoenix, I assume you're a gentleman who wouldn't take advantage of a woman in distress? The implication hung in the air like poison, that Gabriel had somehow manipulated or coerced her, that she couldn't possibly have made her own choices. Your daughter, Gabriel said with dangerous quiet, is a brilliant, capable woman who's perfectly able to make her own decisions. Is she? Harrison's smile was sharp as a blade. Because from where I stand, it looks like she's made some very poor choices in the last 24 hours. Abandoning her responsibilities, her family, her fiancé, for what? A man she's known for less than a day? The words were calculated to wound, to make her feel foolish and impulsive. But instead of shame, Jada felt clarity settle over her like armor. You want to know what I've chosen, she said, stepping closer to Gabriel in a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed. I've chosen honesty over performance. I've chosen authentic connection over business arrangement. I've chosen someone who sees my dreams as valuable rather than inconvenient. Dreams, Harrison scoffed. Jada, you're 28 years old. It's time to put aside childish fantasies and accept your responsibilities. What responsibilities? Jada demanded, her voice growing stronger. To marry a man who doesn't love me? To be a trophy wife for someone who's been cheating on me with my own cousin? The accusation dropped into the room like a bomb. Blake went pale, Victoria's satisfied smile faltered, and Harrison's expression shifted to one of cold calculation. That's a serious accusation, Harrison said slowly. Do you have proof? I saw them, Jada said simply. At the engagement party, in your study. They were intimately involved while discussing how naive I was to believe Blake actually cared for me. Blake started to speak, but Harrison silenced him with a look. This was bigger than a simple family drama now, this was about damage control, about protecting investments and political alliances. Even if that were true, Harrison said carefully, it doesn't change the fundamental reality of your situation. You have responsibilities, Jada. To the family, to the company, to agreements that have already been made. What agreements? Gabriel asked quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the room go still. Harrison's pale eyes focused on Gabriel with new interest. Business agreements, Mr. Phoenix. Surely as a successful entrepreneur, you understand that personal feelings sometimes must be subordinated to larger considerations. Actually, Gabriel said, his voice deadly calm, I've found that business built on lies and coercion rarely ends well for anyone involved. How noble, Victoria said with a laugh that sounded forced. But nobility doesn't pay the bills or maintain family legacies. No, Gabriel agreed, but it does let you sleep at night. The tension in the room was becoming suffocating. Jada could feel the walls of her old life closing in, could see her father marshalling his arguments like weapons. She knew what came next, the guilt, the manipulation, the careful application of pressure until she surrendered and returned to the life that was slowly killing her. But something had changed in her during her time with Gabriel. She'd tasted freedom, authentic connection, the possibility of living according to her own values rather than someone else's expectations. And she wasn't ready to give that up. I won't marry Blake, she said clearly, the words ringing through the room like a bell. I won't return to Davis Media as your compliant heir. And I won't let you use me as a bargaining chip in whatever deal you're trying to make. Harrison's mask of paternal concern finally slipped, revealing the cold businessman beneath. You'll do exactly what you're told, Jada, or you'll find yourself with nothing. No inheritance, no trust fund, no family support. Do you really think Mr. Phoenix here will be interested in a penniless nobody? The threat was everything Jada had feared, everything that had kept her trapped for so long. But instead of the crushing fear she expected, she felt something else, liberation. You know what? She said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Take it. Take the money, the trust fund, the inheritance. Take everything that comes with the Davis name. Because I'd rather have nothing and be free than have everything and be your prisoner. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Blake looked stunned, Victoria appeared calculating, and Harrison's face had gone dangerously still. But it was Gabriel's expression that mattered most to Jada. She saw surprise, admiration, and something that looked like love shining in his green eyes. He stepped closer, his hand finding hers in a gesture of solidarity that felt like coming home. You heard her, Gabriel said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. She's made her choice. Harrison's laugh was cold and brittle. How touching. But I'm afraid it's not that simple. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick folder. You see, there are certain complications that make your romantic gesture less viable than you might think. He placed the folder on Gabriel's coffee table and opened it with theatrical precision. Inside were what looked like contracts, financial statements, and legal documents. Phoenix Industries, Harrison said conversationally, has been experiencing some financial difficulties lately, haven't you, Mr. Phoenix? Several major clients pulling out, some unfortunate patent disputes, cash flow problems that threaten your ability to maintain operations. Gabriel went very still, and Jada felt his hand tighten around hers. How would you know that? Gabriel asked, his voice carefully controlled. Business is my profession, Mr. Phoenix. It's my job to know these things, especially when I'm considering whether to acquire a company. Harrison's smile was predatory. The question is, how badly do you need Davis Media's backing to survive the next fiscal quarter? The implications hit Jada like a physical blow. Her father wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening Gabriel, using his company's vulnerabilities as leverage to control them both. You bastard, she whispered, finally seeing the full scope of her father's manipulation. I prefer a businessman, Harrison said mildly. And the business proposition is simple. Jada returns home, marries Blake as planned, and Phoenix Industries becomes a valued subsidiary of Davis Media with full financial backing and protection. Everyone wins. And if we refuse? Gabriel asked, though they all knew the answer. Then Phoenix Industries files for bankruptcy within 6 months, and Jada discovers what life is like without family support. Harrison's voice was pleasant, conversational, as if he were discussing the weather instead of destroying lives. The room fell silent except for the sound of waves crashing against the shore outside. Jada felt the walls closing in, felt the trap that had been so carefully constructed around them both. Her father had planned for every contingency, every possible rebellion. But as she looked at Gabriel, saw the anguish and fury warring in his expression, she realized something important. Her father might be able to destroy their financial security, but he couldn't destroy what they'd found together. He couldn't take away the love, the connection, the recognition of souls that had found their perfect match. If you've ever faced a moment when everything you've built seems threatened by forces beyond your control, when love and security seem impossible to hold on to simultaneously, you know the choice Jada and Gabriel are facing. Share in the comments, how do you find courage when the stakes feel impossibly high? I need to speak with Jada privately, Gabriel said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Of course, Harrison said graciously, as if he hadn't just delivered an ultimatum designed to tear their lives apart. Take all the time you need. We'll wait outside. As the 3 members of her old life filed out of Gabriel's home, Jada felt the weight of impossible choices settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Love or security? Authenticity or survival? Freedom or responsibility? And she had no idea how to choose without destroying everything that mattered to either of them. Chapter 8. The silence that filled Gabriel's living room after her family left was deafening. Jada could hear the sound of car doors closing outside, could imagine her father making phone calls to set his next phase of manipulation in motion. But it was the look on Gabriel's face that truly broke her heart. Is it true? She asked quietly. What he said about Phoenix Industries? Gabriel ran a hand through his dark hair, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked defeated. Some of it. We've had some setbacks, some unexpected challenges. But we're not on the verge of bankruptcy, at least, we weren't until your father decided to make us his target. What do you mean? Gabriel moved to the windows, staring out at the ocean that had seemed so peaceful just hours before. 3 of our biggest clients canceled contracts in the last month. All of them cited strategic restructuring as the reason. Now I'm wondering if that restructuring had a name, Davis Media. The realization hit Jada like a physical blow. He's been sabotaging you. Setting you up to need his rescue. It's brilliant, actually, Gabriel said bitterly. Create the problem, then offer the solution. Make me desperate enough to accept acquisition terms that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. And I played right into his hands, Jada whispered, understanding flooding through her. By running to you, by creating this situation, I've given him leverage over both of us. Gabriel turned from the window, and the pain in his eyes nearly undid her. The question is, what do we do now? It was the question she'd been dreading, because every answer led to loss. If she stayed with Gabriel, her father would destroy his company and leave them both with nothing. If she returned home, she'd be condemning herself to a life of emotional imprisonment while saving Gabriel's livelihood. I have to go back, she said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. No, Gabriel said fiercely, crossing the room to take her hands. We'll find another way. I can rebuild the company, we can. With what? Jada interrupted gently. Gabriel, I've seen my father destroy people who opposed him. He doesn't just take their money, he takes their reputation, their future, their ability to rebuild anywhere in their industry. If you fight him and lose, you won't just lose Phoenix Industries. You'll lose everything. Gabriel's hands tightened around hers, and she could see him searching for arguments, for alternatives, for any way to avoid the impossible choice her father had forced on them. "What about what you said?" he asked desperately. "About choosing freedom over security? About not being anyone's prisoner?" "I meant it," Jada said, tears beginning to blur her vision. "But I won't drag you down with me. I won't let my freedom cost you everything you've built." "You're not dragging me anywhere," Gabriel said fiercely. "I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. Even if it means losing everything else." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, and Jada could see the war being fought behind his eyes. She understood the magnitude of what she was asking, that he give up his life's work, his financial security, his entire future for a woman he'd known less than 2 days. "Yes," he said finally, and the conviction in his voice took her breath away. "Even then. I'd rather have nothing with you than everything without you." The declaration should have filled her with joy, but instead it broke her heart completely. Because love shouldn't require such devastating sacrifice. Love should lift you up, not tear your life apart. "I can't let you do that," she whispered. "It's not your choice to make," Gabriel said gently. "It's mine." Before Jada could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Gabriel opened it to find Harrison standing alone on the threshold, his expression carefully neutral. "I think we've given you enough time to discuss your options," Harrison said. "Have you reached a decision?" Gabriel stepped aside to let him enter, but his posture was protective, keeping himself between Jada and her father. "We need more time," Gabriel said. "I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have," Harrison replied smoothly. "I have reporters asking questions about Jada's disappearance, business partners asking about the acquisition timeline, and a very impatient political ally whose son is currently standing in my driveway wondering if his fiancée has lost her mind." "Tell Blake he can stop wondering," Jada said, finding her voice despite the pain crushing her chest. "I'm not marrying him under any circumstances." Harrison's eyes sharpened. "Then you're choosing to let Mr. Phoenix's company fail? That seems remarkably selfish for someone who claims to love him." The manipulation was so blatant, so cruel, that Jada felt anger flare alongside her heartbreak. This was how her father operated, creating impossible choices, then making her feel guilty for the consequences of his own actions. "I need to speak with my father alone," Jada said suddenly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Gabriel looked at her with alarm. "Jada, no. Whatever you're thinking. Trust me," she said, meeting his eyes with all the love and conviction she could muster. "Please. Just give me 5 minutes." Gabriel hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with Harrison. But something in her expression must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "I'll be right outside," he said, and the promise in his voice felt like armor around her heart. When they were alone, Harrison's mask of paternal concern slipped entirely. "You always were too smart for your own good," he said, settling into Gabriel's chair like he owned the place. "What is it you think you can negotiate?" "Phoenix Industries," Jada said directly. "You want to acquire it, fine. Make Gabriel an offer he can accept without coercion. A fair offer that compensates him properly for what he's built. And in return, I come home. I marry Blake. I play the dutiful daughter and political wife." The words tasted like poison, but she forced them out. Harrison studied her carefully. "And your feelings for Mr. Phoenix?" "Will be irrelevant," Jada said, though saying it felt like tearing her own heart out. "You get what you want, a compliant heir and a strategic business acquisition. Everyone wins. Except you," Harrison observed with what might have been genuine curiosity. "I stopped mattering to you a long time ago," Jada said quietly. "We both know this isn't about my happiness. It's about control." For a moment, something almost like regret flickered across Harrison's features. "You could have been happy, Jada. Blake is a good match, successful, ambitious, from the right family. Your mother would have approved." "Don't," Jada said sharply. Don't you dare use Mom's memory to justify this. She would have wanted me to marry for love, not convenience. Love, Harrison said with bitter amusement, is a luxury for people who don't have empires to maintain. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Gabriel's phone ringing inside the house. Through the windows, they could see him answering with obvious reluctance. Jada. Harrison's voice had taken on a different quality, not the cold businessman or the manipulative father, but something more vulnerable. I know you think I'm the villain in this story. But everything I've done has been to protect you, to secure your future. By arranging a marriage to a man who's cheating on me? By threatening to destroy the first person who's ever truly seen me? By making sure you'll never be dependent on anyone else's kindness, Harrison said with sudden intensity. Your mother was brilliant, beautiful, generous, and when she got sick, none of that mattered. All that mattered was money. Money for treatments, for specialists, for hope. I couldn't save her, but I can make sure you never face that kind of helplessness. The raw pain in his voice caught Jada off guard. She'd never heard her father speak about her mother's death with such naked emotion. So you decided to make me helpless in a different way, she said softly. Dependent on your approval, your money, your choices instead of my own. I decided to make sure you'd always be protected. Protected isn't the same as loved, Dad. The word, Dad, not Harrison or father, seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, his carefully constructed armor cracked, and she saw the man beneath, afraid, lonely, still grieving the wife he'd lost 15 years ago. But the moment passed quickly, and the cold businessman returned. Love doesn't pay for medical bills, he said harshly. Love doesn't maintain empires or protect legacies. Love is what gets you hurt. Through the window, they could see Gabriel ending his phone call, his face grim. Whatever news he'd received, it wasn't good. It seems, Harrison said, following her gaze, that Mr. Phoenix has just received some unfortunate news about his company's financial situation. Amazing how quickly things can change in the business world. The casual cruelty in his voice made Jada's stomach turn. What did you do? I expedited the timeline, Harrison said with a shrug. Phoenix Industries now has 72 hours to find significant capital investment or face immediate creditor demands. Fortunately, Davis Media is prepared to step in with a generous offer. Gabriel appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. Your father's associates just called, he said to Jada. It seems Phoenix Industries is facing some unexpected financial pressures. How unexpected could they be? Harrison asked pleasantly, when everyone in the industry has been talking about your company's vulnerabilities for months. The game was over, the trap completely sprung. Gabriel's company would fail without Davis Media's intervention, and the only way to secure that intervention was for Jada to sacrifice her own happiness on the altar of her father's ambitions. 72 hours, Gabriel said quietly, looking at Jada with eyes full of pain and resignation. That's how long we have before I lose everything my employees depend on, everything I've built. Or, Harrison said smoothly, you could both be reasonable. Accept the inevitable. Jada comes home, the acquisition goes forward on favorable terms, and everyone gets what they need if not what they want. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Jada could see Gabriel struggling with the decision, could see him weighing his love for her against his responsibility to his employees, his investors, his life's work. I need some air, Jada said abruptly, unable to watch the man she loved being torn apart by her father's manipulations. She walked out onto the terrace where she'd shared her first intimate conversation with Gabriel just the night before. It felt like a lifetime ago, that moment of connection and possibility. Now the same ocean that had seemed so peaceful looked gray and turbulent, matching the storm in her heart. Her phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, "Stop being dramatic and come home. Blake is willing to forgive this whole embarrassing episode if you apologize publicly and commit to the wedding timeline." The casual dismissal of her feelings, the assumption that she should be grateful for Blake's forgiveness after his betrayal, made something snap inside Jada's chest. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly, deeply angry, not hurt or disappointed or resigned, but furious. She was tired of being treated like a chess piece in other people's games. Tired of having her emotions dismissed as inconvenient or dramatic. Tired of being told what she should want, what she should feel, who she should be. If her father wanted to play games, if he wanted to manipulate and threaten and control, then maybe it was time she learned to play by his rules. But first, she needed to know exactly what she was up against. With sudden determination, Jada pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Dr. Marcus Webb, came the familiar voice of her family's longtime attorney. "Marcus, it's Jada Davis. I need to ask you some questions about my mother's will and the family trust agreements. And I need you to be completely honest with me, regardless of what my father might prefer." It was time to stop being a victim of her father's machinations and start fighting back with weapons of her own. Chapter 9. Dr. Marcus Webb's voice carried 20 years of legal wisdom and genuine affection when he answered Jada's call. He'd been her family's attorney since before she was born, had helped draft her mother's will during those final, desperate months, and had watched Jada grow from a precocious child into a woman trapped by circumstances she'd never fully understood. "Jada," he said warmly, "it's been too long. How are you holding up?" "I've been better," she admitted, glancing through the window where she could see Gabriel and her father engaged in what looked like tense conversation. "Marcus, I need to ask you about my inheritance, about the terms of my mother's will. My father's been controlling certain aspects of my life, and I need to understand what my actual legal rights are." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "That's a complicated question, Jada. What specifically are you trying to understand?" "Everything," she said firmly. "The trust fund, the company shares, the foundation my mother established for environmental causes. My father acts like he has complete control over all of it, but I'm starting to wonder if that's actually true." Another pause, longer this time. "Jada, where are you having this conversation? Are you somewhere private?" The question sent a chill down her spine. "Why?" "Marcus, what aren't you telling me?" "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that you and I need to have a face-to-face conversation. Soon. There are aspects of your mother's will and your trust arrangements that your father may not have explained completely." "What kind of aspects?" "The kind that could change everything you think you know about your situation," Marcus said quietly. "But not over the phone. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning?" "I'm not in New York right now," Jada said, glancing again at the scene inside the house. "But I can be there by tonight if necessary." "Make it necessary," Marcus said urgently. "Jada, whatever decisions you're facing, don't make them until we've talked. Promise me." The gravity in his voice made her pulse quicken. "I promise." After ending the call, Jada stood for a moment on the terrace, her mind racing. What could Marcus know that would change everything? What had her father kept from her about her own inheritance? She was about to go back inside when she heard voices coming from Gabriel's study, her father and Blake, speaking in low, urgent tones. The window was partially open, and their words carried clearly in the still morning air. "Can't let this drag on much longer," Blake was saying. "The media is starting to ask questions, and my father's getting nervous about the political implications." "I understand the timeline pressure," Harrison replied coldly. "But my daughter seems to have developed some inconvenient backbone. It may take more persuasion than originally anticipated." "What kind of persuasion?" Blake asked, and there was something in his tone that made Jada freeze. "The kind that reminds her of her obligations," Harrison said smoothly. "Jada has always been motivated by guilt and responsibility. We simply need to apply the right pressure points." "And Phoenix?" Phoenix will fold within the week, Harrison said with casual confidence. I've made sure of that. Once his company fails, he'll be desperate enough to accept any terms we offer. And Jada will see that her little rebellion has consequences for people she cares about. What if she still refuses? Blake pressed. What if she's willing to let his company fail rather than come back? Harrison's laugh was cold and calculating. Then we move to phase 2. The environmental foundation she thinks she's been funding anonymously? The one she's so passionate about? It would be a shame if their major donor suddenly withdrew support, wouldn't it? All those marine conservation projects, all that research she cares about so deeply, gone. Jada felt the blood drain from her face. Her secret foundation, the work that had given her life meaning for years, the projects that were actually making a difference in ocean conservation, her father knew about all of it. Had probably known for years. You've been monitoring her activities? Blake asked, sounding impressed despite himself. I monitor everything that affects my family's interests, Harrison said matter-of-factly. Did you really think I'd let my daughter move millions of dollars without oversight? The foundation is funded through accounts I control. One phone call, and her little environmental crusade disappears. And the personal angle? Blake asked, his voice taking on an uglier tone. This Phoenix character, what's to stop him from continuing to pursue her even after his company fails? Men like Phoenix are proud, Harrison said with dismissive confidence. Once he realizes he can't provide for her, can't protect her from financial realities, his ego will do the work for us. He'll convince himself that walking away is the noble thing to do. And if his ego isn't enough? Then we remind him that certain government contracts his company has been pursuing could become very difficult to obtain. That regulatory reviews of his patents could become very thorough and time-consuming. That accidents happen in the tech industry, industrial espionage, cyber attacks, unfortunate coincidences that destroy careers. The casual way her father discussed destroying Gabriel's life made Jada feel physically sick. This wasn't just business maneuvering, this was systematic emotional terrorism designed to force compliance through fear and desperation. Jesus, Harrison, Blake said, and even he sounded disturbed by the scope of the manipulation. Don't you think you're going a little far? I'm doing what's necessary to protect my family's interests, Harrison replied coldly. Your family's interests too, in case you've forgotten. This marriage isn't just about Jada, it's about the political connections your father needs, the business opportunities that benefit us both. I won't let my daughter's temporary infatuation destroy years of careful planning. Temporary infatuation, Blake repeated thoughtfully. Is that all you think this is? What else could it be? Harrison's voice carried genuine puzzlement. She's known the man for 2 days. It's obviously some kind of emotional rebellion, probably triggered by pre-wedding anxiety. Once she faces the reality of what her choices will cost, him, her foundation, her future, she'll make the sensible decision. Jada had heard enough. She backed away from the window, her mind reeling with the scope of her father's manipulations. Every choice she thought she'd had was an illusion. Every decision had been orchestrated to funnel her toward the outcome Harrison wanted. But Marcus's words echoed in her mind, there were aspects of her inheritance that could change everything. Maybe her father's control wasn't as absolute as he believed. She found Gabriel in the kitchen, staring out at the ocean with the same defeated expression he'd worn since her father's arrival. When he looked up and saw her face, his expression immediately shifted to concern. What's wrong? He asked, moving to her side. You look like you've seen a ghost. I overheard my father and Blake talking, she said quietly, then told him everything, the threats to his company, the plans to destroy her foundation, the casual discussion of using fear and manipulation to control their choices. Gabriel's face grew progressively darker as she spoke, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Son of a bitch, he said quietly when she finished. He's not just threatening us, he's threatening everyone and everything we care about. There's more, Jada said, pulling out her phone. I called our family attorney. He says there are things about my mother's will, about my inheritance, that my father hasn't told me. Things that could change everything. Gabriel's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of things? I don't know yet. But Marcus sounded urgent, almost scared. He wants to meet with me immediately. Then we go, Gabriel said decisively. Today. Right now. Gabriel, if I leave with you now, my father will accelerate his timeline. He'll destroy your company out of spite. Let him try, Gabriel said fiercely. I'm not going to let him blackmail us into submission. There has to be another way, and if your family attorney knows something that could help. Their conversation was interrupted by Harrison's voice from the doorway. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Both Jada and Gabriel turned, and she wondered how much he'd overheard. But Harrison's expression was pleasantly neutral, giving nothing away. Actually, Jada said, decision crystallizing in her mind, you are interrupting something important. I'm leaving. To go where? Harrison asked, his voice sharpening with suspicion. To get some answers, Jada said, moving toward Gabriel's side in a gesture of solidarity. About my inheritance, about my rights, about exactly how much control you actually have over my life. Something flickered in Harrison's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or concern. Jada, I don't think you understand the implications of. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I understand that you've been manipulating and threatening and controlling my entire life. I understand that you see me as a business asset rather than a daughter. And I understand that it's time I learned the truth about what my mother actually left me. Your mother left you well provided for, Harrison said carefully. But with certain conditions, certain responsibilities. Then I guess I need to find out exactly what those conditions are, Jada said. From someone who doesn't have a vested interest in keeping me ignorant. Harrison's mask of paternal concern was beginning to crack. If you walk out that door with him, if you continue this ridiculous rebellion, there will be consequences. For both of you. There already are consequences, Jada said quietly. The consequence of living a lie, of betraying everyone I love to maintain your version of order. I'm done paying that price. She looked at Gabriel, saw the pride and love shining in his green eyes, and felt strength she didn't know she possessed flowing through her veins. Are you with me? She asked him. Always, Gabriel said without hesitation. Together, they walked toward the door, leaving Harrison standing in the kitchen with his threats and manipulations. But as they reached Gabriel's car, Jada's phone rang with an unknown number. Don't answer it, Gabriel said, seeing her hesitation. But something made her accept the call. Hello? Miss Davis? The voice was warm, maternal, with a slight Spanish accent. This is Carmen Rodriguez. I work for Mr. Phoenix. Jada looked at Gabriel in confusion. Carmen? His housekeeper, Gabriel explained, then spoke into the phone. Carmen, what's wrong? How did you get this number? I got it from your emergency contacts, Mijo, Carmen said, her voice tight with worry. I'm calling because there are men here, at the house. They say they're from the bank, but something doesn't feel right. They're taking pictures, measuring rooms, acting like they own the place. Gabriel's face went pale. What men? What bank? They have papers, legal documents. They say Phoenix Industries defaulted on some loan, that they're here to assess assets for seizure. But Mr. Phoenix, the timing. It's too convenient, yes? Right after your lady friend's family shows up. Through the phone, they could hear voices in the background, official-sounding men discussing property values and asset liquidation. We're coming, Gabriel said tersely. Don't let them take anything until we get there. I try, but they have badges, paperwork. They say they have every right. The line went dead. Gabriel stared at his phone, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He's moving faster than I thought. They're not waiting for the 72 hours. Can he do that? Jada asked, though she already knew the answer. Her father's reach was longer and more ruthless than she'd ever imagined. With the right connections, the right pressure applied to the right people? Yes. Gabriel's voice was grim. Your father doesn't just play dirty, he rewrites the rules of the game entirely. Behind them, Harrison emerged from the house with Blake and Victoria, his expression calmly satisfied. He'd heard the phone call, had probably orchestrated the timing to maximum effect. Still planning to drive off into the sunset? Harrison asked pleasantly. Because it seems Mr. Phoenix has some pressing business matters to attend to. The trap was closing around them with mechanical precision. Gabriel's company was being dismantled in real time, her foundation was under threat, and every move they made seemed to play into Harrison's hands. But as Jada looked at Gabriel's face, saw the determination burning in his eyes despite the impossible odds, she realized something important. Her father's greatest mistake was assuming that love made people weak. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. Yes, she said clearly, getting into Gabriel's car. We're still planning to drive off into the sunset. But first, we're going to stop this war you started. Gabriel smiled grimly and started the engine. Time to fight back. As they drove away from the coastal sanctuary that had briefly been their paradise, Jada felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of rebellion, the strength that came from having something worth fighting for. Her father had taught her well about power and manipulation. Now she was going to use those lessons against him. The drive to Manhattan would take 3 hours. 3 hours to plan their counterattack, to turn the tables on Harrison Davis, and to discover just how much power Jada actually possessed. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 10. The drive to Dr. Marcus Webb's Manhattan office was tense and silent, both Jada and Gabriel lost in their own thoughts about the battle they were about to wage. Gabriel's phone rang constantly, his employees, his investors, reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of Phoenix Industries' sudden financial crisis. Each call brought worse news, confirmation that Harrison Davis's influence reached into every corner of the business world. But it was when Gabriel's business partner Olivia called that the true scope of the attack became clear. Gabriel, Olivia's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Where the hell are you? The entire board is in emergency session, the SEC is asking questions about our financial reporting, and somehow every major tech publication has received anonymous tips about our creative accounting practices. What creative accounting practices? Gabriel demanded, putting the call on speaker so Jada could hear. Exactly, there aren't any. But someone has fabricated evidence that looks convincing enough to trigger investigations. Professional, expensive fabrications that would take serious resources to create. Jada met Gabriel's eyes, seeing her own understanding reflected there. This wasn't just business competition, this was character assassination on a scale that only someone with Harrison's resources could orchestrate. How long do we have? Gabriel asked grimly. Maybe hours before trading is suspended, Olivia said. Gabriel, I don't know how to fight this. Whoever is behind it has connections everywhere, banks, regulators, media. They're not trying to acquire us anymore. They're trying to destroy us completely. After Gabriel ended the call, the car was quiet except for the sound of traffic and Jada's racing heartbeat. She'd known her father was ruthless, but this level of coordinated destruction was beyond anything she'd imagined. I'm so sorry, she whispered, guilt crushing her chest. This is all because of me. Because I ran to you, because I... Stop, Gabriel said firmly, reaching over to take her hand. This isn't your fault. This is what predators do when their prey fights back, they escalate until they win or destroy everything trying. But your company, your employees. We'll be fine, Gabriel said with more confidence than she felt he possessed. Because we're not going to let him win. Dr. Marcus Webb's office occupied the top floor of a building that had housed prestigious law firms for over a century. Marcus himself was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen decades of family drama and corporate intrigue. But when he greeted Jada, his expression was unusually grave. "Jada," he said, embracing her warmly before turning to Gabriel with professional interest. "And you must be Gabriel Phoenix. I've been following the news about your company with concern." "You know about that?" Gabriel asked, surprised. "I know about everything Harrison Davis does that affects his family," Marcus said grimly. "Including this coordinated attack on Phoenix Industries. Shall we sit down? What I have to tell you will change everything you think you know about your situation." In the elegant conference room overlooking Central Park, Marcus spread documents across the polished table, legal papers, financial statements, and what looked like copies of her mother's will. "Jada," Marcus began carefully, "how much do you actually know about your mother's death?" The question caught her off guard. "She had cancer. Fought it for 2 years before she died when I was 16. "And your inheritance? The trust funds, the company shares? Father controls everything until I marry an appropriate partner or turn 35, Jada recited automatically. "That's what he's always told me." Marcus and Gabriel exchanged a look that made her pulse quicken. "What aren't you telling me?" she demanded. Marcus sighed heavily. "Jada, your father has been lying to you about almost everything for the past 12 years. The words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "Your mother's will," Marcus said, sliding papers toward her, "made you the primary beneficiary of her entire estate when you turned 25, not 35. You've been legally entitled to your inheritance for 3 years. Jada stared at the documents, the formal legal language swimming before her eyes. "That's impossible," Father said. "Your father said what he needed to say to maintain control," Marcus interrupted gently. "There's more. The environmental foundation you think you've been funding secretly? Your mother established it in your name before she died. You're not the anonymous donor, you're the founder and primary trustee. But the money comes from accounts Father controls." "No," Marcus said firmly. "The money comes from your trust fund, which you've had legal access to for years. Your father has been managing it as your financial advisor, but only because you never asserted your rights as the actual owner." Gabriel leaned forward, his business instincts sharpening. "How much money are we talking about?" Marcus consulted another document. "Currently, approximately $800 million, plus substantial shareholdings in Davis Media and several other corporations." The number was so large it didn't seem real. Jada had always known her family was wealthy, but this level of personal fortune was staggering. "But that's not the most important revelation," Marcus continued. "Jada, do you know why your mother really died?" The question sent ice through her veins. "Cancer." "You just asked me that." "She did have cancer," Marcus said slowly. "But she also had access to experimental treatments that could have saved her life. Treatments your father refused to authorize." "That's impossible," Jada whispered. "He loved her. He would have done anything." "He loved controlling her," Marcus corrected gently. "Your mother wanted to liquidate assets to fund a massive expansion of environmental conservation efforts. She wanted to use the family fortune to fight climate change, to preserve ocean ecosystems. Your father saw this as financial suicide." The room seemed to spin around Jada as the implication sank in. "Are you saying he let her die to prevent her from spending their money on environmental causes?" "I'm saying he made a choice between extending her life and protecting what he saw as the family's financial future. And he chose the money." Gabriel's hand found hers across the table, anchoring her as her entire understanding of her family history crumbled. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. "Your mother's final instructions were very specific. If you ever chose to pursue environmental work professionally, if you ever found a partner who supported your passions rather than trying to control them, the entire inheritance was to be released to you immediately. No conditions, no waiting periods. She knew, Jada breathed. Somehow, she knew what father would try to do. Your mother was brilliant, Marcus said with obvious admiration. She understood Harrison's need for control, and she built safeguards into her will to protect you from exactly the situation you're in now. Gabriel was studying the documents with sharp attention. What would trigger the release? Specifically, professional engagement in environmental conservation work, or marriage to someone who supports rather than controls Jada's career ambitions, Marcus read from the will. Either condition makes her the immediate and absolute owner of her inheritance. And the company shares? Gabriel pressed. 35% of Davis Media, Marcus said. Enough to block any acquisition or major business decision. Your father has been operating under a legal fiction that he controls those shares. In reality, they've belonged to Jada for 3 years. The magnitude of her father's deception was breathtaking. Not only had he stolen her inheritance, but he'd built his entire business strategy around assets he didn't actually control. Why didn't you tell me this before? Jada asked, struggling to process the revelations. Marcus looked genuinely pained. Because your mother made me promise to let you discover your own path first. She didn't want you to feel pressured by the inheritance or to make choices based on financial considerations. But she also left instructions that if Harrison ever tried to force you into marriage or threatened someone you loved, I was to reveal everything immediately. And threatening Gabriel's company qualifies? Threatening Gabriel's company, your foundation, your freedom to choose, yes, it all qualifies. Marcus pulled out his phone. In fact, I've already begun the legal process to assert your rights. By tomorrow morning, Harrison will discover that every financial move he's made in the last 72 hours was done without authority. Jada felt power flooding through her veins like electricity. Not just financial power, though that was significant, but the power of truth, of finally understanding the real battlefield. What about Phoenix Industries? Gabriel asked. Can we stop what's happening to my company? Marcus smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. Jada, as of right now, you have enough liquid assets to buy Phoenix Industries outright if necessary. But more importantly, you have enough influence with Davis Media's board to stop Harrison's campaign of corporate destruction immediately. How? Emergency board meeting, Marcus said, already pulling out legal documents. As a major shareholder, you can call one at any time. And as of today, you own more shares than Harrison knows about. Gabriel was looking at Jada with something close to awe. You've been an environmental foundation director for years without knowing it. You've been a major media heiress without knowing it. What else don't you know about yourself? Before Jada could answer, her phone rang. Harrison's name appeared on the screen. Don't answer it, Marcus advised. Let him wonder. By the time he figures out what's happening, it will be too late for damage control. But Jada was already accepting the call, her newfound power giving her courage she'd never possessed before. Hello, Father, she said calmly. Jada. Harrison's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing with this little tantrum, but it ends now. Phoenix Industries is finished, your foundation is being dismantled, and if you don't come home immediately, I'll make sure Gabriel Phoenix never works in technology again. Actually, Jada said, meeting Gabriel's eyes across the table, I think you'll find that your threats have lost their bite. What the hell does that mean? It means I know the truth now. About Mother's will, about my inheritance, about everything you've been hiding from me for 12 years. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. I don't know what lies you think you've uncovered, Harrison began. No lies, Jada interrupted. Just legal documents, financial records, and the testimony of the man who drafted Mother's will. Did you really think you could steal my inheritance forever? You ungrateful little. Careful, Jada said sweetly. You're talking to someone who now owns 35% of your company and has enough liquid assets to destroy you as thoroughly as you tried to destroy Gabriel. I'd suggest you choose your next words very carefully. The power shift was complete, and Harrison knew it. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its commanding authority. What do you want? I want you to stop the attacks on Phoenix Industries immediately. I want Blake to announce publicly that our engagement is over by mutual agreement. And I want you to never, ever threaten someone I love again. And if I refuse? Jada looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Then I call an emergency board meeting of Davis Media and reveal to the other shareholders that you've been making major business decisions with assets you don't actually control. I destroy your reputation the same way you tried to destroy Gabriel's. And I use my mother's fortune to fund the biggest environmental conservation initiative in history, exactly what she wanted and exactly what you tried to prevent. The threats hung in the air, backed by legal authority and financial power Harrison had never imagined she possessed. You've changed, he said finally, and for the first time in years, there was something like respect in his voice. No, Jada said quietly. I've just finally become who I was always meant to be. After she hung up, the conference room was quiet except for the sound of traffic far below. Gabriel was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, pride mixed with love mixed with something that looked like awe. So, he said finally, what happens now? Jada looked at the legal documents spread across the table, at Marcus's encouraging smile, at Gabriel's beautiful face, and felt the last of her old life falling away like a discarded shell. Now, she said, we build something beautiful together. Chapter 11. 3 days later, Jada stood in the boardroom of Davis Media, facing 12 of the most powerful executives in the media industry. For the first time in her life, she sat at the head of the table, not as Harrison's daughter, but as a major shareholder in her own right. The emergency board meeting had been called for 9 a.m. sharp, and every member was present. Harrison sat at the opposite end of the table, his face a mask of controlled fury, while Blake shifted uncomfortably in the chair beside him. The other board members looked curious and slightly confused about the sudden gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus Webb began, standing at Jada's right side with a stack of legal documents, thank you for attending on such short notice. We're here because significant irregularities have been discovered in the company's recent business decisions. What kind of irregularities? Asked Margaret Chen, the lead independent director. Marcus nodded to Jada, who rose with more confidence than she'd ever felt in her life. The kind that involve making major acquisitions and business attacks using assets that were never properly authorized, Jada said clearly. My father has been operating under the assumption that he controls my mother's estate, including her substantial shareholdings in this company. That assumption was incorrect. She gestured to Marcus, who began distributing copies of the legal documents. As you can see from these papers, I became the legal owner of Elizabeth Davis's estate 3 years ago, including 35% of Davis Media stock. Every business decision made using those shares without my explicit consent was done without proper authority. The boardroom erupted in murmurs as the executives realized the implications. Harrison's face had gone ashen, but he remained silent. This includes, Jada continued, the recent coordinated attacks on Phoenix Industries, the manipulation of financial markets to force acquisitions, and the use of company resources to interfere with legitimate businesses. Margaret Chen looked up from the documents, her expression sharp. Are you saying that Harrison has been using unauthorized shares to make business decisions? I'm saying, Jada replied, that my father has been acting without proper legal authority for 3 years. And that as of today, I'm exercising my rights as a major shareholder to stop any business practices that involve market manipulation or corporate harassment. This is ridiculous, Harrison said, finally breaking his silence. Jada doesn't understand the complexities of. I understand perfectly, Jada interrupted, her voice carrying new authority. I understand that you've been using my inheritance to fund business vendettas. I understand that you've been threatening and manipulating people I care about. And I understand that it stops now. She turned to address the full board. I'm calling for an immediate halt to all acquisition activities involving Phoenix Industries, and I'm requesting a full audit of any business decisions made using Davis Media resources for personal vendettas rather than legitimate business purposes. The vote was swift and unanimous. Even Harrison's closest allies couldn't support business practices that lacked proper authorization. As the meeting concluded and the board members filed out, Harrison approached Jada with an expression she'd never seen before, defeat mixed with something that might have been admiration. "You've learned to fight," he said quietly. "I learned from the best," Jada replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil in her chest. "The question is, what happens now between us?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter with new eyes. "I suppose," he said finally, "that depends on whether you can forgive a foolish old man who confused control with protection." "I can forgive," Jada said softly. "But I can't forget. And I can't go back to being your obedient little girl who lets you make all her choices." "I wouldn't want you to," Harrison said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice for the first time in years. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." The admission, coming from the man who'd manipulated and controlled her for so long, brought tears to Jada's eyes. But they were tears of relief, not sadness, the relief of finally being seen and acknowledged for who she truly was. That evening, Jada drove back to Gabriel's coastal sanctuary, her heart racing with anticipation and nervousness. So much had changed in just a few days, her entire understanding of herself, her family, her future. But through all the revelations and confrontations, one thing had remained constant, her love for Gabriel Phoenix. She found him on the beach where they'd shared their first perfect afternoon together, standing at the water's edge and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. He'd heard her car in the driveway, had been waiting for her, and when he turned to watch her approach, the smile that spread across his face was like coming home. "How did it go?" he asked, opening his arms to her. Jada walked into his embrace, feeling the rightness of being held by him, of being exactly where she belonged. "It went perfectly," she said, pulling back to look into his green eyes. "Phoenix Industries is safe, my father's campaign of harassment is over, and I am officially the owner of a ridiculously large fortune that I have absolutely no idea what to do with." Gabriel laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. "I might have some suggestions about that." "Oh really?" Jada asked, standing on her toes to brush her lips against his. "What kind of suggestions?" "The kind that involve changing the world together," Gabriel said, his arms tightening around her. "Environmental foundations, ocean conservation, using technology and resources to make a real difference." "That sounds like exactly the kind of trouble I want to get into," Jada said, and kissed him properly, pouring all her love and relief and hope for the future into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He led her back to his studio, but when he opened the doors, Jada gasped in amazement. The space had been transformed, not just with his paintings, but with photographs, research documents, and artistic renderings of ocean conservation projects. The walls were covered with a visual representation of their shared future, their combined passions and dreams. "When did you do all this?" she asked, moving through the space in wonder. "While you were in New York fighting dragons," Gabriel said, watching her reaction carefully. "I realized that whether we had money or not, whether my company survived or not, I wanted to spend the rest of my life building something meaningful with you." In the center of the studio, on the easel where his painting of the storm-lost woman had once stood, was a new canvas. This one showed the same woman, but she was no longer lost or running. She stood strong and confident, her face turned toward the sunrise, her hand extended toward a future full of possibility. "She found her way home," Gabriel said softly. "Yes," Jada whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She did. Gabriel moved to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Marry me," he said quietly, the words spoken directly into her ear. Jada turned in his arms, her heart racing. "Gabriel." "Not because of money or convenience or business arrangements," he continued, his hands framing her face. "Marry me because I love you. Because you make me want to be the best version of myself. Because I want to spend the rest of my life creating beautiful things with you, art and businesses and foundations and maybe someday a family." "Yes," Jada said, the word coming out as a sob of pure joy. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." Gabriel's kiss was desperate and tender and full of promise, and as the last light of sunset streamed through the studio windows, Jada felt the final pieces of her new life clicking into place. They made love that night with the same desperate passion they'd shared before, but now it was overlaid with the security of knowing they'd fought for each other and won. Every touch was a celebration, every whispered word a promise, every shared breath a testament to the love that had transformed them both. Afterward, they lay entwined in Gabriel's bed, planning their future together. The environmental foundation would be expanded globally, Phoenix Industries would develop new technologies for ocean cleanup, and they would build something unprecedented, a partnership that was equal parts business empire and love story. "What do you think your mother would say?" Gabriel asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Jada's bare shoulder. "I think," Jada said, pressing a kiss to his chest, "she would say that love is the most powerful force in the universe when it's freely given and fiercely protected." "Smart woman." "The smartest," Jada agreed. "She knew that someday I'd need the courage to fight for real love, and she made sure I'd have the weapons to win." 1 year later, Jada stood in the same studio where Gabriel had first shown her his paintings of her, but now the space served as the headquarters of the Phoenix Davis Foundation for Ocean Conservation. The walls were covered with photographs of restored coral reefs, successful cleanup projects, and marine life that had been saved through their combined efforts. She wore a simple white dress, her natural hair crowned with flowers from Gabriel's garden, and her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. Gabriel stood beside her in a dark suit, his paint-stained hands now bearing a simple gold wedding band, his face radiant with happiness. Carmen Rodriguez, who had become the grandmother figure neither of them had expected but both desperately needed, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as the small gathering of friends and colleagues celebrated the announcement. "To new beginnings," Gabriel said, raising his glass of sparkling cider. "To love that transforms everything it touches," Jada added, her voice rich with emotion. "To the future," they said together, and kissed as the sun set over the ocean that had brought them together and would always be their sanctuary. Outside, waves crashed against the shore in their eternal rhythm, but inside the studio filled with art and love and hope, Jada Davis Phoenix finally understood what her mother had known all along, that authentic love wasn't just worth fighting for, it was worth everything. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the courage to run away from what's wrong and race toward what's right. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that home isn't a place at all, it's a person who sees your soul and chooses to cherish it exactly as it is. What would you choose, the safe path or the passionate unknown? Share your thoughts below about the moments when love asked you to be brave, when you had to choose between security and authenticity. Subscribe, like, and comment about your own experiences with choosing authentic love over convenient arrangements. Your stories inspire others to believe that real love, transformative, soul-deep, passionate love, is still possible.